In the grand halls of Ravenshollow Palace, where whispers carry more weight than crowns and loyalty comes with a price, the Ashford royal family faces their greatest crisis yet. When Prince Alexander signs what appears to be a simple custody agreement for his children, he unknowingly triggers a chain of events that will expose decades of hidden scandals, forbidden alliances, and a conspiracy that reaches the very heart of the monarchy. What begins as a private family matter quickly spirals into a public reckoning that threatens to bring down the most powerful family in the kingdom. The autumn rain drummed against the windows of Pemberton Manor as Prince Alexander Ashford sat across from his estranged wife, Princess Victoria, in the oak-paneled study. Between them lay a stack of legal documents that would determine the future of their two young children, Prince William and Princess Charlotte. The custody negotiations had dragged on for months, each session more contentious than the last, but today felt different. Victoria's lawyer, a sharp-eyed woman named Margaret Thornfield, wore an expression of barely contained satisfaction that made Alexander's stomach churn. "Your Highness," Margaret began, her voice crisp and professional, "my client is prepared to accept the terms we discussed, provided you agree to the additional clause regarding public appearances." She slid a single sheet of paper across the mahogany table. Alexander's eyes scanned the document quickly, noting the standard language about shared custody and holiday arrangements. It seemed reasonable enough, perhaps too reasonable given Victoria's previous demands for full custody. The additional clause appeared innocuous at first glance. It simply stated that both parents would maintain discretion regarding their private lives and would consult each other before making any public statements that might affect the children's welfare. Alexander had expected something far more restrictive. His own lawyer, James Whitmore, a family friend who had served the royal family for decades, nodded approvingly as he reviewed the terms. "This seems quite fair, Alexander," James whispered. "Much better than we anticipated." Alexander picked up the gold-plated pen that had once belonged to his grandfather, King Edward VII, and hesitated for just a moment. Something about Victoria's demeanor troubled him. Throughout their marriage, she had never been one to compromise easily. Yet here she was, agreeing to joint custody when she had previously demanded complete control. Her green eyes held a glint that he recognized but couldn't quite place. Victoria had always been beautiful, with her flowing auburn hair and porcelain complexion, but there was a hardness to her features now that hadn't been there when they first met at Cambridge University 15 years ago. Back then, she had been Lady Victoria Pemberton, the daughter of a minor nobleman with political ambitions. Their courtship had been a whirlwind of charity galas, polo matches, and carefully orchestrated photo opportunities that had captivated the public imagination. "Are you certain about the financial arrangements?" Alexander asked, stalling for time as he tried to understand what was bothering him. The settlement was generous, perhaps too generous. Victoria would receive a substantial annual allowance, the use of Pemberton Manor, and a trust fund for the children's education. In return, she was giving up any claim to royal titles for herself and agreeing to relatively modest restrictions on her public activities. "Perfectly certain," Victoria replied, her voice steady but with an undertone that Alexander couldn't decipher. "I simply want what's best for William and Charlotte. Surely you can understand that." Margaret leaned forward slightly, her expensive perfume filling the space between them. "Your Highness, if I may, time is of the essence. My client has other obligations this afternoon, and these terms are quite favorable to both parties." Alexander looked once more at his children's photographs on the side table. William, now 8, with his father's dark hair and serious expression, and Charlotte, 6, whose bright smile reminded him of happier times with Victoria. Whatever reservations he had paled in comparison to his desire to maintain a relationship with his children. The public scrutiny of their divorce had been brutal, with tabloid headlines speculating about everything from infidelity to financial impropriety. The truth was far more complicated. Alexander's marriage to Victoria had been failing long before the public became aware of their problems. What had started as genuine affection had gradually transformed into a cold partnership focused more on public duty than private happiness. Victoria had grown increasingly distant, spending more time with her social circle than with her family. There had been rumors, of course, whispers about inappropriate friendships and suspicious absences, but Alexander had chosen to ignore them for the sake of their children and the monarchy's reputation. As he signed his name with a flourish, Alexander felt a mixture of relief and apprehension. The legal battle was over, but something told him that this was just the beginning of a much larger conflict. Victoria's smile as she witnessed his signature was too triumphant for someone who had supposedly compromised. Margaret gathered the documents with practiced efficiency, making copies for each party and ensuring that all signatures were properly witnessed. Excellent, Margaret announced. The agreement is now binding. Your Highnesses should expect the custody schedule to begin next Monday. She paused, consulting her leather portfolio. There is one more matter to discuss, but perhaps we should address that privately. Alexander's lawyer frowned. This hadn't been mentioned in their preparatory meetings. What matter? James demanded. Victoria stood gracefully, smoothing her navy blue dress. Alexander, there's something you should know about your brother Philip and his financial dealings. Margaret has some documents that might interest you. The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. Prince Philip, Alexander's younger brother, was third in line to the throne and had always been the more charismatic and popular of the two princes. His charitable foundation had made him a media darling, and his marriage to Lady Sarah Montague had produced two children who were considered the future of the monarchy. What kind of documents? Alexander's voice was carefully controlled, but internally alarms were ringing. Philip had always been somewhat careless with money, but he had never been involved in anything truly scandalous. Margaret produced a manila envelope from her briefcase. These are financial records showing transactions between Prince Philip's foundation and several offshore companies. The amounts are substantial and the timing is interesting. Inside were bank statements, wire transfer records, and what appeared to be encrypted communications between Philip and someone identified only as A.W. The amounts were staggering, millions of pounds moving through accounts in the Cayman Islands, Switzerland, and Monaco. The dates corresponded with several high-profile charity events that Philip had organized over the past 3 years. Where did you get these? Alexander's voice was barely above a whisper. Victoria exchanged a glance with Margaret before responding. Does it matter? The question is what you plan to do with this information. Your brother has been stealing from his own charity, Alexander. Money that was supposed to help disadvantaged children has been lining his pockets and funding a rather extravagant lifestyle. The implications were staggering. If this information became public, it wouldn't just destroy Philip's reputation. It would devastate the entire royal family. The monarchy had survived many scandals over the centuries, but financial corruption involving children's charities would be nearly impossible to overcome. Alexander's mind raced through the potential consequences. His father, King George VIII, was already in poor health, and the stress of such a scandal might kill him. The constitutional crisis that would follow could threaten the very existence of the monarchy. What do you want? Alexander asked. Though he suspected he already knew the answer, Victoria's smile was cold and calculating. Nothing unreasonable. I simply want to ensure that our children are protected from any potential scandal. If Philip's activities become public, it will affect their future as well. She paused, letting the threat sink in. However, if certain accommodations could be made regarding my own social activities, I might be persuaded to keep this information confidential. The pieces began falling into place. This had never been about custody. It had been about leverage. Victoria had somehow obtained evidence of Philip's criminal activities and was now using it to secure her own position. The custody agreement was just the first step in a larger plan. Alexander realized that he had been outmaneuvered completely. Margaret consulted her watch. Your Highness, my client needs an answer today. The charity's board meeting is scheduled for next week, and there are journalists already asking questions about the foundation's financial transparency. Once that investigation begins in earnest, these documents will inevitably surface. Victoria gathered her purse and coat. I'll expect your decision by tomorrow evening, Alexander. In the meantime, I suggest you have a very frank conversation with your brother. As the two women left the study, Alexander slumped in his chair, the weight of the situation pressing down on him like a physical force. James sat in stunned silence, occasionally glancing at the financial documents spread across the table. This is a disaster, James finally said. If even half of this is true, Philip could face criminal charges. The scandal would be unprecedented. Alexander picked up his phone to call Philip, then hesitated. Once he made that call, there would be no going back. The conversation would force both brothers to confront truths they had been avoiding for years. Philip's spending habits had been a source of concern for the family, but everyone had assumed it was simply poor financial management rather than actual theft. The evidence before Alexander suggested something far more sinister, a systematic pattern of fraud that had been going on for years. The rain continued to fall outside as Alexander finally dialed his brother's number. Philip answered on the third ring, his voice cheerful and relaxed. Alexander, how did the custody meeting go? I hope Victoria wasn't too difficult. The casual tone made Alexander's task even harder. How do you tell your brother that his life is about to be destroyed? Philip, we need to talk immediately. Can you come to Pemberton Manor? There was a pause on the other end of the line. Is everything all right? You sound terrible. Alexander looked at the documents again, noting the systematic nature of the fraud. This wasn't a momentary lapse in judgment. It was a carefully planned scheme that had been operating for years. "Just come, Philip, and don't bring Sarah. This needs to be a private conversation." As Alexander waited for his brother's arrival, he tried to process the full implications of Victoria's revelation. She had clearly been planning this for months, perhaps years. The custody battle had been a smokescreen, designed to get him to sign an agreement while she held the real leverage in reserve. Now she had him exactly where she wanted him, desperate to protect his family and willing to make almost any concession to keep Philip's crime secret. The sound of tires on gravel announced Philip's arrival. Through the window, Alexander watched his younger brother emerge from his silver Aston Martin, adjusting his tie and checking his reflection in the side mirror. Philip had always been vain about his appearance, and his wife Sarah had only encouraged that tendency. As the future king's brother, Philip had access to the finest tailors, jewelers, and lifestyle advisors that money could buy. The question now was whether that money had come from legitimate sources or from the children's charity he was supposed to be protecting. Philip entered the study with his characteristic confidence, but his expression changed when he saw the documents scattered across the table. The color drained from his face as he recognized bank statements and transfer records that he thought had been safely hidden. "Where did you get those?" he whispered, sinking into the chair that Victoria had vacated an hour earlier. "That's not important right now," Alexander replied. "What matters is whether they're authentic." Philip's silence was answer enough. The two brothers stared at each other across the table, years of unspoken tensions finally coming to the surface. Alexander had always suspected that Philip resented being the younger son, forever in line behind someone he considered less charismatic and less capable. This scandal would confirm that resentment had transformed into something much more destructive. The study fell silent except for the ticking of the grandfather clock and the continuing rain against the windows. Both men understood that their lives had just changed irrevocably, though neither yet realized how much deeper the conspiracy would prove to be. Prince Philip's hand shook as he reached for the bank statements, his usual confident demeanor crumbling like ancient parchment. Alexander watched his brother's face cycle through denial, anger, and finally a resignation that was more frightening than any emotional outburst could have been. The grandfather clock in the corner marked the passage of time with its steady rhythm, but both men felt as though they were suspended in a moment that would define the rest of their lives. "How long have you known?" Philip's voice was barely audible, his eyes fixed on a wire transfer record showing £2 million moving from the children's charity account to a company called Meridian Holdings in the Cayman Islands. Alexander had never heard of Meridian Holdings, but the timing of the transfer coincided with Philip's purchase of a yacht that had made headlines in the society pages 6 months earlier. "I found out an hour ago," Alexander replied, studying his brother's face for any sign of the explanation he desperately hoped to hear. "Please tell me there's some reasonable explanation for this. Please tell me you haven't been stealing from sick children." The words hung in the air between them like an accusation that neither man wanted to acknowledge. Philip stood abruptly and walked to the window, his reflection ghostly in the rain-streaked glass. For several minutes he said nothing, just stared out at the gardens where they had played as children. Those had been simpler times, when their greatest concern was avoiding their tutors long enough to climb the ancient oak tree that still dominated the landscape. "You wouldn't understand," Philip finally said. "You've never had to live in someone else's shadow your entire life." The bitterness in his voice caught Alexander off guard. He had always assumed that Philip was content with his role as the charming younger prince, free from the burdens of succession but enjoying all the privileges of royal life. "What does that have to do with embezzling charity funds?" Alexander demanded, rising from his chair. "What does your jealousy have to do with stealing money meant for children's hospitals?" Philip spun around, his eyes blazing with years of suppressed resentment. "Everything. Do you have any idea what it's like to be the spare? To know that no matter what you accomplish, no matter how hard you work, you'll always be an afterthought?" He gestured wildly at the opulent study around them. "This will all be yours someday. The crown, the palaces, the respect. What do I get? A ceremonial role and a modest allowance that barely covers the expectations placed on me." Alexander felt a chill that had nothing to do with the autumn weather. "So you decided to help yourself to charity money? Money donated by ordinary people who trusted you to help children in need." The moral weight of Philip's actions was staggering, but what terrified Alexander more was the calculating coldness he now saw in his brother's expression. "It started small," Philip admitted, returning to his chair with the defeated posture of a man who had finally been caught. "A few thousand here and there to cover expenses that the royal household wouldn't approve, but then I realized how easy it was. The charities board trusted me completely. They never questioned my decisions or demanded detailed accounting. It was almost insulting how naive they were. Margaret's documents told a more systematic story. Alexander spread them across the table, noting the progression from small irregularities to massive transfers.
This shows over £8 million moving through offshore accounts over 3 years, Philip. This isn't covering expenses. This is organized fraud.
The numbers were staggering, representing donations from thousands of ordinary citizens who had trusted the royal family with their hard-earned money.
Philip's confession continued in a monotone voice, as if he were recounting someone else's crimes. Sarah knew, of course. She helped set up some of the accounts. Her connections in international banking made it possible to move money without triggering automatic reporting requirements. The revelation that Lady Sarah was involved made the situation exponentially worse. She was beloved by the public, known for her charitable work and her role as a devoted mother to the next generation of royals. "Your wife is involved in this?" Alexander's voice rose despite his efforts to maintain composure. "Sarah helped you steal from children's charities?" The image of his sister-in-law at recent public events, graciously accepting donations and speaking passionately about helping disadvantaged youth, took on a sinister new meaning. Every smile, every heartfelt speech, every photo opportunity had been a calculated deception. "She didn't have a choice," Philip said defensively. "We were already in too deep by the time she found out. The lifestyle expectations, the social obligations, the constant pressure to maintain appearances. Do you have any idea how expensive it is to be royal in the modern world?" His justification sounded hollow even to himself, but Alexander could see the desperation that had driven his brother to increasingly reckless behavior. The documents revealed a sophisticated operation involving multiple shell companies, cryptocurrency transfers, and even what appeared to be art purchases that were later resold at suspicious profits. Margaret's research had been thorough. She had transaction records, email communications, and even photographs of Philip and Sarah at private banking facilities in Monaco and Singapore. "How did Victoria get all this information?" Alexander demanded. Philip's expression grew even darker. "Andrew Winston. He's been documenting everything for months." The name hit Alexander like a physical blow. Andrew Winston was a former royal protection officer who had been dismissed 3 years earlier under mysterious circumstances. He had subsequently disappeared from public view, though there had been occasional rumors about him working as a private investigator for wealthy clients seeking compromising information about public figures. "Winston was blackmailing you?" Alexander tried to piece together the timeline. If Winston had been gathering evidence for months, this scandal was much larger than a simple custody dispute. Victoria's timing suggested a coordinated plan that went far beyond securing a favorable divorce settlement. "What does he want?" "Money, initially," Philip explained, but then Victoria approached him with a different proposition. He wanted evidence that could be used to control the royal family's response to her demands. Winston saw an opportunity to profit from multiple sources. The pieces of the conspiracy were becoming clearer, but Alexander realized that he still didn't understand the full scope of Victoria's ambitions. The study door opened unexpectedly, and both brothers turned to see James Whitmore returning with a grim expression. "Alexander, I'm afraid we have another problem. I just received a call from a contact at The Guardian. They're preparing a story about financial irregularities in royal charities. The article is scheduled to run tomorrow morning." Alexander felt the last of his hopes crumble. If the story was already written, their options for damage control were severely limited. "How much do they know?" Philip asked, though his tone suggested he already feared the worst. James consulted his notes grimly. "They have transaction records, source testimony, and what they claim is documentary evidence of systematic fraud. They've reached out to the palace for comment, but they're proceeding with publication regardless of our response." The media's involvement meant that the royal family's private crisis was about to become a public catastrophe. Alexander's phone buzzed with an urgent message from Victoria. "Check your email. Time is running out." He opened his laptop with trembling hands, finding a message that contained not just the financial evidence they had already seen, but dozens of photographs showing Philip and Sarah at various international banking locations, often accompanied by individuals who appeared to be facilitating illegal transactions. One photograph showed Philip shaking hands with a man identified in the caption as Viktor Petrov, a Russian oligarch known for his connections to money laundering operations. Another showed Sarah signing documents at a bank in the Bahamas while a man who looked suspiciously like Andrew Winston stood nearby. The implications were staggering. This wasn't just charity fraud, but potentially international money laundering with connections to organized crime.
"Dear God, Philip," Alexander whispered, staring at a photograph that showed his brother boarding a private yacht with several individuals whose faces had been flagged by Interpol.
"What have you gotten involved with?" Philip's face had gone completely white, and he was gripping the arms of his chair so tightly that his knuckles were stark against his skin. It wasn't supposed to go that far, Philip said desperately. Petrov offered investment opportunities that would have allowed us to return the charity money with interest. We thought we could cover our tracks and actually benefit the children's causes in the long run. Alexander recognized the rationalization of a desperate man, but the evidence suggested something far more sinister than poor investment decisions. James was frantically making phone calls, trying to reach contacts in the media who might be able to delay publication. But Alexander could tell from his expression that their efforts were futile. The Guardian was known for its investigative journalism and its willingness to take on powerful institutions. Once they decided to run a story, political pressure rarely changed their minds. "We need to contact Father immediately," Alexander said, dreading the conversation that would follow. King George VIII had been battling health problems for the past year, and his doctors had warned the family about avoiding unnecessary stress. This scandal would not only devastate him emotionally, but could literally threaten his life. The prospect of calling his father with news that would potentially destroy the monarchy weighed on Alexander like a physical burden. "Maybe there's still time to contain this," Philip said weakly, but even he didn't sound convinced. Alexander's laptop chimed with another message from Victoria. "The restaurant at 8 p.m. Come alone and bring your brother's signed confession. Last chance." The location was discreet, a private dining room at an exclusive hotel where conversations couldn't be overheard. Victoria was offering one final negotiation, but Alexander suspected her terms would be more demanding than anything they had discussed previously. Philip read the message over Alexander's shoulder. "What does she want?" he asked, though his tone suggested he was beginning to understand the true scope of Victoria's ambitions. Alexander was starting to suspect that Victoria's goals went far beyond financial security or social freedom. The systematic nature of her evidence gathering suggested someone with access to professional intelligence resources and long-term strategic planning. "I think she wants to destroy us," Alexander said quietly, voicing the suspicion that had been growing since he first saw Margaret's documents. "I think this was always about revenge, not custody or money." The realization that his former wife had been planning his family's downfall for years was almost too devastating to accept. Every intimate conversation, every shared moment, every expression of love had potentially been a lie designed to gather information for future use. As the two brothers prepared for what might be their last evening as respected members of the royal family, neither could have imagined how much deeper the conspiracy would prove to be, or how many other powerful figures were already positioning themselves to benefit from the monarchy's potential collapse. The private dining room at the Dorchester was decorated in muted golds and deep burgundy, its thick curtains drawn against the London evening. Alexander arrived precisely at 8 o'clock, finding Victoria already seated at the far end of a mahogany table set for 4. She wore an elegant black dress that seemed appropriately funereal for what Alexander suspected would be the death of his family's reputation. 2 additional place settings suggested that this meeting would include participants he hadn't anticipated. "You're punctual," Victoria observed, not bothering to stand as Alexander approached. "I wasn't certain you'd come alone." Her eyes moved to the leather portfolio under his arm, which contained Philip's handwritten confession, a document that detailed every fraudulent transaction and implicated several other members of the royal household staff who had facilitated the money laundering operation. "Where's Philip?" Victoria asked, though her tone suggested she already knew the answer. Alexander had left his brother at Pemberton Manor, where Philip was attempting to craft a resignation letter that might preserve some fragment of his dignity. The conversation had been brutal, filled with recriminations and desperate bargaining that had ultimately proven futile. Philip's position was indefensible, and both brothers understood that his public life was effectively over. "He's composing his public statement," Alexander replied, taking the seat across from Victoria. "Though I suspect you already have that drafted as well." Victoria's slight smile confirmed his suspicion. She had orchestrated every aspect of this crisis with the precision of a military campaign, and Alexander was beginning to understand that his family had been outmaneuvered by someone far more capable than they had ever imagined. The dining room door opened to admit 2 figures who made Alexander's blood run cold. The first was Andrew Winston, the disgraced former protection officer, whose presence explained how Victoria had obtained such detailed intelligence about royal family activities. Winston was a compact man with graying hair and intelligent eyes that missed nothing, qualities that had made him an excellent security professional before his dismissal for reasons that had never been made fully public. The second arrival was even more disturbing. Dame Margaret Fitzgerald, the former MI6 deputy director who had retired under mysterious circumstances 2 years earlier. Her presence suggested that Victoria's operation had government intelligence backing, or at least tolerance. Dame Margaret was known for her ruthless efficiency and her connections throughout the British establishment, including members of Parliament who had long questioned the monarchy's relevance in modern Britain. "Your Highness," Dame Margaret said with mock formality as she took her seat, "I trust you've had time to consider the full implications of your situation." Her posh accent couldn't disguise the steel beneath her polite words. Alexander realized that he was facing not just a vindictive ex-wife but a sophisticated intelligence operation designed to destabilize the monarchy itself. Andrew Winston remained silent, but his presence was intimidating enough. As a former protection officer, he had access to years of confidential information about royal family activities, financial arrangements, and personal relationships. His dismissal had officially been attributed to a security breach, but Alexander was beginning to suspect that Winston had been gathering intelligence for his own purposes long before his termination. "What do you want?" Alexander asked, deciding that direct confrontation was his only remaining option. "You obviously have enough evidence to destroy my brother and probably the entire royal family. What's your price?" Victoria exchanged glances with Dame Margaret before responding, and Alexander realized that Victoria might not be the primary architect of this conspiracy. "The monarchy is an anachronism," Dame Margaret said in the matter-of-fact tone she might have used to discuss the weather.
"An expensive luxury that Britain can no longer afford."
"The public is already questioning the royal family's value, and this scandal will provide the final push toward a modern Republican government." Alexander felt the room spinning as he understood the true scope of their ambitions. "You're trying to overthrow the government," he said, his voice barely steady. "This isn't about custody or even revenge. You're attempting a bloodless coup." Dame Margaret's approving nod confirmed his worst fears. The conspiracy against his family was actually a conspiracy against the British constitutional system itself, with Victoria serving as the inside agent who had spent years gathering the intelligence necessary to bring down the monarchy. Victoria leaned forward, her green eyes glittering with an intensity that Alexander had never seen during their marriage. "Do you remember our 3rd anniversary dinner?" she asked conversationally. "You spent the entire evening discussing your plans for modernizing the monarchy when you became king. You had such idealistic notions about transparency and accountability." Alexander did remember that conversation, and now understood why Victoria had seemed so interested in his reform proposals. "You've been planning this for years," Alexander said, the pieces finally falling into place. "Everything, our marriage, the children, the divorce, it was all designed to position you for this moment." Victoria's expression softened slightly, revealing what might have been genuine regret beneath her calculated facade. "Not everything was false, Alexander, but I realized early in our marriage that you would never have the strength to make the changes that Britain truly needs." Andrew Winston finally spoke, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to giving orders. "The evidence we've gathered extends far beyond your brother's charity fraud. We have documentation of tax avoidance schemes, illegal arms sales facilitated through royal connections, and environmental crimes committed by companies with royal warrants." Each accusation hit Alexander like a physical blow, and he realized that his family's problems were far more extensive than he had imagined. Dame Margaret opened her briefcase and withdrew a thick folder marked with the official seal of the Cabinet Office. "These are preliminary reports from a parliamentary commission that was established 6 months ago to investigate royal finances. The commission doesn't yet know about Prince Philip's activities, but they will when The Guardian publishes their story tomorrow morning." Alexander understood the threat. Even if they could somehow contain the charity scandal, a parliamentary investigation would uncover additional crimes that could justify abolishing the monarchy entirely. "What do you want us to do?" Alexander asked, though he suspected the answer would be devastating. Victoria consulted her watch before responding. "Your father needs to abdicate immediately, before the scandal breaks. You will renounce your claim to the throne and support a transition to a Republican government. In exchange, your family will be allowed to retain some private properties and avoid criminal prosecution." The terms were essentially unconditional surrender disguised as a negotiation. Alexander realized that his choice was between voluntary abdication and forced removal through criminal proceedings that would destroy his family's reputation and their financial security. "You're asking me to end 1,000 years of constitutional monarchy," he said, the weight of history pressing down on him like a physical burden. "I'm offering you the chance to end it with dignity," Victoria corrected. "The alternative is a public trial that will expose every corrupt transaction, every illegal favor, every abuse of public trust committed by your family over the past 3 decades. Andrew Winston produced a digital tablet showing news websites that were already reporting rumors about royal financial improprieties. The story was gaining momentum faster than Alexander had thought possible. Dame Margaret stood and walked to the window, her silhouette elegant against the London skyline. Public opinion polling shows that support for the monarchy has been declining steadily for the past 5 years. This scandal will provide the justification that Parliament needs to hold a referendum on abolishing the royal family entirely. You can either lead that transition or be dragged through it. Alexander understood that the political momentum was already building, regardless of his family's response. The children, Alexander said desperately, thinking of William and Charlotte sleeping peacefully at home while their entire world was being destroyed. What happens to them? Victoria's expression softened genuinely for the first time that evening. They'll be protected. Their trust funds are separate from royal holdings, and they can choose whether to use their titles as adults, but they need to be insulated from the scandal that's coming. Alexander's phone buzzed with an urgent call from James Whitmore. He answered reluctantly, knowing that the news would be devastating. Alexander, James's voice was shaky with panic. The Guardian has moved up their publication schedule. The story goes online in 2 hours. We need to respond immediately or accept that we'll be entirely reactive to their narrative. The timeline had just accelerated beyond anyone's control. Dame Margaret returned to the table with a prepared statement that would announce King George VIII's abdication due to health concerns, followed by Alexander's renunciation of his succession rights in favor of democratic reform. Sign this now, and we can release it simultaneously with the Guardian story. Frame this as your family's choice rather than a forced response to scandal. Alexander stared at the document, understanding that his signature would end not just his own royal career, but the monarchy itself. I need to call my father, Alexander said, though he dreaded the conversation that would follow. King George had dedicated his entire life to serving the crown, and learning that his life's work was ending in disgrace might kill him. Victoria nodded sympathetically. You have 1 hour to secure his agreement. After that, events will proceed without his cooperation. As Alexander prepared to make the most difficult phone call of his life, he couldn't help but marvel at the sophistication of the trap that had been set for his family. Every move they might make had been anticipated and countered. Every potential escape route had been blocked. Victoria and her allies had spent years preparing for this moment, and their victory was now inevitable. The monarchy that had survived world wars, economic depressions, and countless political crises was about to fall to a conspiracy orchestrated by the woman Alexander had once loved enough to marry. King George VIII received his son's phone call in the blue drawing room of Buckingham Palace, where he had been reviewing state papers despite his doctor's orders to rest. At 78, the king's health had been declining steadily, but his mind remained sharp enough to understand immediately that Alexander's halting explanation represented the end of everything he had spent his life protecting. The silence that followed Alexander's confession stretched for nearly a minute before the king spoke in a voice that sounded decades older than it had that morning. How long do we have? The king asked, his characteristic composure intact despite the magnitude of the crisis. Alexander could hear the television in the background. BBC News was already running breaking news alerts about unprecedented developments involving the royal family, though the specific details remained vague. The media feeding frenzy was beginning even before the full story broke, suggesting that Victoria's allies had been feeding information to multiple outlets simultaneously. The Guardian publishes in 45 minutes, Alexander replied, standing in the hotel corridor outside the dining room where Victoria and her conspirators waited. Dame Margaret has given us 1 hour to accept their terms voluntarily. The king's sharp intake of breath was audible over the phone connection, and Alexander could imagine his father's mind racing through the implications of such an ultimatum. Margaret Fitzgerald is involved? The king's voice carried a new note of alarm. Alexander, if she's part of this conspiracy, then we're facing something far more serious than a family scandal. Margaret has connections throughout the intelligence services and the political establishment. This could be a coordinated effort to destabilize the government itself. Alexander hadn't fully considered the broader political implications, but his father's assessment made the situation even more terrifying. Inside the dining room, Victoria was speaking quietly with Andrew Winston, while Dame Margaret reviewed documents on her laptop. Through the partially open door, Alexander could see additional figures arriving. People he didn't recognize but whose bearings suggested government or intelligence backgrounds. The conspiracy was larger than he had imagined, with resources and planning that extended far beyond what a vengeful ex-wife could have orchestrated alone. Father, there's something else, Alexander said, his voice barely above a whisper. They have evidence of other crimes, financial irregularities, illegal arms deals, environmental violations. They claim to have a complete dossier of royal family activities spanning decades. The king's silence was more ominous than any outburst could have been. Alexander realized that his father might not be entirely surprised by these allegations. I need to speak with the Prime Minister, the king said finally. If this is a coordinated attack on the monarchy, then the government's response will determine whether we can survive it. But Alexander could hear the defeat in his father's voice. They both understood that political support for the royal family had been eroding for years, and a scandal of this magnitude might provide politicians with the excuse they needed to distance themselves from an increasingly unpopular institution. Alexander returned to the dining room to find Victoria reviewing what appeared to be polling data on her tablet. Early responses to news alerts are running 73% in favor of a full investigation, she announced without looking up. Public trust in royal institutions has fallen to historic lows, even before the specific allegations become public. Dame Margaret nodded approvingly, as if Victoria were a student delivering a particularly impressive presentation. The Prime Minister has been briefed, Dame Margaret added, consulting her phone. Her response was diplomatically neutral, but I think we can assume that Downing Street will prioritize political survival over royal loyalty. No politician wants to be seen defending financial corruption, especially when it involves children's charities. Alexander felt another piece of his world crumble as he realized that his family's political support was evaporating in real time. Andrew Winston had been monitoring multiple news feeds on his laptop, and his expressions suggested that events were accelerating beyond anyone's control. BBC is reporting that Parliament will hold an emergency session tomorrow morning to discuss the royal family's role in charitable organizations. They're already treating this as a constitutional crisis. Alexander understood that once Parliament became involved, the momentum for abolishing the monarchy would become unstoppable. Your father has 10 minutes to accept our terms, Victoria said, checking her watch. After that, we proceed with the alternative scenario. Alexander didn't want to ask about the alternative scenario, but Dame Margaret was happy to explain. Criminal referrals to the Crown Prosecution Service, parliamentary hearings, and a referendum on the monarchy's future. Your family's reputation will be destroyed, and they'll likely face significant jail time. Alexander's phone rang with a call from James Whitmore, whose panicked voice suggested that their legal situation was deteriorating rapidly. Alexander, I've just spoken with contacts at the CPS. They've received preliminary evidence packets and are preparing to launch formal investigations. The charity fraud is just the beginning. They have documentation of tax evasion, money laundering, and what appears to be influence peddling involving arms exports to questionable regimes. Alexander realized that his family's legal troubles extended far beyond anything Philip had confessed. Victoria stood and moved to the window, her silhouette elegant against the London skyline. Your brother's activities were small-scale compared to the systematic corruption we've documented. The charity fraud was simply the most emotionally compelling way to begin the narrative. She turned back to Alexander with something that might have been pity in her expression. You were never aware of most of it, which is why you'll be offered immunity in exchange for cooperation. The implication was clear. Alexander's ignorance of his family's criminal activities was both his salvation and his humiliation. He would survive the scandal, but only by accepting that his father and brother had been systematically corrupt for years, while he remained obliviously focused on his ceremonial duties. What about my children? Alexander asked, dreading the answer but knowing he had to secure their protection above all else. William and Charlotte will retain their trust funds and educational opportunities, Dame Margaret replied, but they'll be raised as private citizens without titles or royal obligations. Frankly, they'll be better off without the burden of representing an institution that has outlived its usefulness. Alexander wanted to argue, but he could see the logic in her assessment. His children would be free from the suffocating expectations that had destroyed their uncle, and might ultimately destroy their grandfather. Alexander's phone buzzed with a text message from his father. I'm signing the abdication papers. God save Britain. The king's decision to surrender without further resistance suggested that he understood something about the conspiracy's scope that he hadn't shared with his son. Alexander wondered what other evidence Dame Margaret's allies possessed, and whether his father was protecting him from even more devastating revelations. It's done, Alexander announced to the room. The king will abdicate within the hour. Victoria nodded solemnly, but her expression suggested satisfaction rather than regret. Dame Margaret immediately began making phone calls to coordinate the release of prepared statements that would frame the abdication as a voluntary reform. The narrative was being carefully controlled to minimize public sympathy for the royal family. The Guardian's website updated at precisely 9 o'clock with a story headlined, Royal Charity Scandal, Prince Philip accused of embezzling millions from children's organizations. The article was devastating in its detail, featuring bank records, witness testimony, and photographs that painted a picture of systematic frauds spanning several years. Alexander's phone immediately began ringing with calls from journalists seeking comment, but he let them all go to voicemail. Within minutes, the story was being picked up by international media outlets. CNN led with British royal family in crisis, while French television networks interrupted regular programming to report on what they called the end of the Windsor dynasty. Social media exploded with commentary ranging from outrage to satisfaction that the royal family was finally being held accountable for their privileged lifestyle. Dame Margaret monitored the public reaction on multiple screens, occasionally sharing particularly relevant comments with Victoria and Andrew Winston. Public sentiment is running strongly against the monarchy, she reported. The hashtag #AbolishTheMonarchy is trending worldwide, and early polling suggests that 68% of British citizens support a transition to Republican government. Alexander watched his family's reputation disintegrate in real time, understanding that recovery would be impossible. Alexander's personal phone rang with a call from his father's private secretary. "Your Majesty." The formal address felt surreal under the circumstances. "The king has completed the abdication documents and will address the nation at 10 o'clock. The Prime Minister has agreed to schedule a parliamentary vote on the monarchy's future for next week." Alexander realized that he was now technically the King of England, though his reign would likely last less than 24 hours. "I need to return to the palace," Alexander told Victoria, though he wasn't sure what he hoped to accomplish there. His father would need support during what were likely his final hours as king, and Alexander wanted to ensure that William and Charlotte were protected from the media chaos that was about to engulf their family. Victoria nodded sympathetically, and for a moment her mask of calculated professionalism slipped to reveal something that might have been genuine regret. "For what it's worth," Victoria said quietly, "I did love you once, but I realized that love wasn't enough to overcome the fundamental problems with an institution that has no place in the modern world." Alexander stared at her, trying to reconcile the woman he had married with the architect of his family's destruction. The transformation was complete and irreversible. As Alexander left the hotel, he could see crowds gathering outside Buckingham Palace despite the late hour. Some carried signs demanding the monarchy's abolition, while others seemed to be mourning the end of an era. Television crews were setting up equipment for what would likely be an all-night vigil as the nation processed the most significant constitutional change in centuries. The drive through London felt surreal, with emergency services directing traffic around crowds that grew larger as he approached the palace. Alexander's protection officers maintained professional composure, but he could see the strain in their faces as they contemplated their own uncertain futures. The entire royal household staff would likely be unemployed within weeks, as the machinery of monarchy ground to a halt. At Buckingham Palace, Alexander found his father sitting alone in the throne room, staring at the chair that had symbolized royal authority for centuries. King George looked impossibly frail, but his eyes remained clear and determined. "I've called Philip," the king said without looking up. "He'll resign all his positions and accept whatever criminal charges follow. It's the only way to preserve what little dignity we have left." Father and son sat in silence for several minutes, both understanding that they were witnessing the end of everything their family had represented for over 1,000 years. The weight of history pressed down on them, but so did the knowledge that their reign had ended not through war or revolution, but through their own failures and the machinations of those they had trusted. The final act was about to begin. 3 months after the abdication, Alexander sat in the modest study of his new home in the Cotswolds, a far cry from the opulent palaces that had once defined his existence. The cottage, though comfortable, represented the dramatic reduction in circumstances that had followed his family's fall from power. Through the window, he could see his children playing in the garden under the watchful eye of their new nanny, a necessity given the continued media attention that followed their every movement despite their official loss of royal status. The referendum on the monarchy's future had been swift and decisive. 67% of British voters had chosen to establish a Republican government, with a transition to be completed within 18 months. President-elect Sarah Chen, the former Speaker of the House of Commons, had been gracious in victory, promising that the royal family would be treated with dignity during the transition period. Alexander found her kindness more painful than open hostility would have been. Philip's trial had concluded 2 weeks earlier with a guilty verdict on all counts of fraud, money laundering, and tax evasion. He had been sentenced to 8 years in prison, though his lawyers expected him to serve no more than 4 with good behavior. Alexander visited him weekly, sitting across from his brother in the sterile visiting room of Her Majesty's prison Pentonville, an irony that wasn't lost on either of them, given that Philip was imprisoned in an institution that still bore their family's name despite their fall from grace. Their father's health had deteriorated rapidly following the abdication, and he now resided in a private care facility in Scotland. The doctors attributed his decline to stress and depression rather than any specific medical condition. But Alexander understood that the king was simply dying of heartbreak. The man who had dedicated 78 years to serving the crown couldn't survive its destruction, regardless of what the medical professionals believed. Victoria had remarried 6 weeks after the divorce was finalized, choosing a prominent European businessman whose wealth and connections suggested that her ambitions extended beyond merely destroying the British monarchy. Alexander had seen photographs of the wedding in glossy magazines, a lavish affair in Monaco that seemed designed to demonstrate Victoria's successful transition to a new life unburdened by royal obligations. Their children spent alternate weekends with her, returning with stories of private jets and Mediterranean villas that made their reduced circumstances even more stark. Dame Margaret Fitzgerald had been appointed as the first director of the Republican Transition Authority, a government body responsible for managing the conversion from monarchical to Republican institutions. Her press conferences were models of bureaucratic efficiency, presenting the dismantling of centuries-old traditions as a simple administrative process. Alexander watched these briefings with fascination and horror, marveling at how easily someone could speak about erasing history as if it were merely an outdated filing system. Andrew Winston had disappeared entirely following the scandal's resolution, though Alexander suspected he was working under an assumed identity for intelligence agencies that preferred to keep their involvement in the monarchy's overthrow unofficial. The former protection officer had never faced criminal charges despite his central role in gathering evidence against the royal family, a fact that suggested powerful protection from prosecution. Alexander wondered occasionally what other prominent families or institutions might be in Winston's current crosshairs. The international reaction to Britain's Republican transformation had been mixed but largely accepting. Republican movements in other constitutional monarchies had gained momentum, particularly in Canada and Australia, where referendums on abolishing ties to the British crown were scheduled for the following year. Alexander realized that his family's disgrace was becoming a catalyst for worldwide constitutional change that would outlast any individual scandal. The financial settlement had been more generous than Alexander had expected, though still a fraction of what the royal family had previously controlled. He retained ownership of several private properties and a modest trust fund that would support his children's education and basic living expenses. The bulk of royal assets had been transferred to the new Republican government, which planned to convert many palaces into museums and cultural institutions. Buckingham Palace would become the Museum of British Constitutional History, with special exhibits devoted to the monarchy's final years. Alexander's relationship with his children had grown stronger despite, or perhaps because of, their changed circumstances. William and Charlotte seemed to thrive without the burden of royal expectations, attending local schools where they were known simply as William and Charlotte Ashford rather than as Prince and Princess. Their teachers reported that both children were academically gifted and socially well-adjusted, suggesting that they would succeed in whatever careers they eventually chose. On this particular afternoon, Alexander was reviewing correspondence from his literary agent regarding a proposed memoir about the monarchy's final years. Several publishers had expressed interest in his perspective on the events that had transformed British society, though Alexander remained uncertain about whether he wanted to relive those painful months in print. The advance payments being offered were substantial enough to secure his family's financial future, but the emotional cost of revisiting his father's humiliation and his brother's crimes felt almost unbearable. His phone rang with a call from James Whitmore, who had successfully reinvented himself as a private attorney specializing in constitutional law. "Alexander," James's voice carried an excitement that Alexander hadn't heard since before the scandal broke. "I've just received some interesting information that might change how we understand what happened to your family." Alexander felt a familiar dread settle in his stomach. He had spent months trying to achieve some measure of peace with his new circumstances, and he wasn't certain he wanted to revisit the conspiracy that had destroyed his old life. "What kind of information?" Alexander asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer would be disturbing. James had been conducting his own investigation into Dame Margaret's background, driven partly by professional curiosity and partly by loyalty to his former clients. "I've been analyzing financial records from several intelligence contractors, and I think Victoria's operation had backing from foreign governments. This wasn't just about abolishing the British monarchy. It was about destabilizing British institutions more generally. If foreign powers had been involved in orchestrating his family's downfall, then the referendum result might have been influenced by international manipulation rather than genuine domestic opinion." Alexander realized that his family might have been victims of a sophisticated intelligence operation rather than simply the authors of their own destruction. "Which governments?" Alexander asked, though he dreaded the answer. "Russian, Chinese, and possibly Iranian intelligence services." James replied. The financial trails are complex, but there's evidence of coordination between Dame Margaret's associates and intelligence operatives from all three countries. They saw an opportunity to weaken British democratic institutions by eliminating one of the country's most stabilizing traditional elements. Alexander felt a mixture of vindication and horror as he understood that his family's personal failings had been exploited by hostile foreign powers. What does this mean for the referendum? Alexander asked, though he suspected that public knowledge of foreign interference would create a constitutional crisis that might be worse than the original scandal. James had clearly been considering the same question. Legally, there are grounds to challenge the referendum's validity if we can prove that public opinion was manipulated by foreign disinformation campaigns. But politically, I'm not sure the country could survive another constitutional upheaval so soon after the transition to Republican government. Alexander walked to the window and watched his children playing cricket with a casual joy that had been impossible during their royal years. They were laughing at William's failed attempt to bowl a decent ball to Charlotte, who was proving to be remarkably skilled for a 7-year-old. The sight reminded Alexander that his primary responsibility was protecting their happiness, rather than seeking historical vindication for his family's reputation. What would you recommend? Alexander asked. We could pursue a criminal investigation into foreign interference, which might lead to Victoria and Dame Margaret facing treason charges, James replied. But that would likely take years to resolve and would subject your children to renewed media attention. Alternatively, we could simply document the evidence for historical purposes and allow the Republican transition to proceed without further disruption. Alexander appreciated James's honesty about the costs of seeking justice. The front door opened to admit Mrs. Work Henderson, the housekeeper who had loyally followed Alexander from Pemberton Manor despite the dramatic reduction in her duties and salary. She carried the afternoon mail, which included the usual collection of interview requests, book proposals, and letters from supporters who believed the monarchy had been unjustly destroyed. Alexander had stopped reading most of these communications months earlier, finding that they only reinforced his sense of loss without offering any path forward. Your Majesty, Mrs. Henderson said, using the title that was technically still correct, despite its practical irrelevance. There's a rather unusual letter in today's post. It's from someone claiming to be Andrew Winston. Alexander felt his blood run cold. Winston's disappearance had been complete, and Alexander had assumed that the former protection officer was either dead or living under an assumed identity in a country without extradition treaties. The letter was handwritten on expensive stationery with a return address in Singapore. Alexander opened it with trembling hands, finding Winston's distinctive penmanship unchanged despite the months that had passed since their last encounter. Your Royal Highness, the letter began, with mocking formality, I trust that you and your family have adjusted well to your new circumstances. I am writing to inform you of certain developments that may be of interest regarding the events that led to your abdication. Winston's letter continued with revelations that made James's intelligence discoveries seem modest by comparison. The former protection officer claimed to have been working as a double agent for British intelligence throughout the conspiracy, gathering evidence of foreign interference while appearing to cooperate with Dame Margaret's operation. According to Winston, MI6 had been aware of the plot against the monarchy for over a year, but had allowed it to proceed in order to identify and neutralize a larger network of foreign agents operating within British institutions. The sacrifice of your family's reputation was deemed necessary to protect national security interests that transcended the monarchy's survival. Winston wrote with characteristic bluntness. Your father was briefed on certain aspects of the operation, though he was never told that his abdication was part of a counterintelligence strategy designed to expose foreign interference in British politics. Alexander felt the room spinning as he realized that his father might have known more about their situation than he had ever revealed. The letter concluded with an offer that Alexander found both tempting and terrifying. Winston claimed to possess documentary evidence that could not only exonerate the royal family, but also expose the foreign conspiracy that had targeted British institutions. However, releasing this evidence would require Alexander to testify before a secret parliamentary committee and potentially return to public life as a witness in what would become the largest espionage trial in British history. Alexander set the letter aside and called to his children, who abandoned their cricket match to join him for afternoon tea. As they chatted about school friends and weekend plans, Alexander marveled at their resilience and adaptability. They had lost their royal status, their inheritance, and their place in history, but they had gained something perhaps more valuable: the freedom to become whoever they chose to be rather than who tradition demanded they become. That evening, after the children were asleep, Alexander sat in his study staring at Winston's letter and James's research about foreign interference. The evidence suggested that his family had been pawns in a geopolitical game that extended far beyond their personal failings. Yet pursuing vindication would require sacrificing the quiet peace they had finally achieved, and it would likely expose William and Charlotte to renewed scrutiny just as they were beginning to heal from the trauma of their public disgrace. Alexander thought about his father, dying slowly in a Scottish care facility, while believing that his life's work had ended in shameful failure. The old king deserved to know that his family's destruction had served a larger purpose, that their sacrifice had helped protect British democracy from foreign manipulation. But Alexander also understood that such knowledge might be too painful for a man whose health was already failing under the weight of perceived failure. The phone rang with an international call from Victoria, who was vacationing on her new husband's yacht in the Mediterranean. "Alexander," her voice carried a warmth that seemed genuine rather than calculated. "I've seen some concerning news reports about investigations into foreign interference in British politics. I wanted to make sure you and the children are safe." Alexander found her apparent concern both touching and infuriating given her role in creating the very dangers she now claimed to worry about. "Are you still working for them?" Alexander asked bluntly, referring to the foreign intelligence services that James had identified. Victoria's long pause suggested that she was carefully considering her response. "I never worked for anyone except myself," she finally said. "But I may have been used by people whose motivations I didn't fully understand. If that's true, then I owe you and the children more than an apology." As Alexander ended the call and prepared for bed, he realized that his choice would ultimately determine not just his family's future, but potentially the future of British democracy itself. The evidence of foreign interference demanded investigation and prosecution, but such a course would require him to sacrifice the peaceful obscurity that had become his family's greatest treasure. Standing at the window of his modest cottage, Alexander looked out at the English countryside that had shaped his ancestors for centuries. Tomorrow he would have to decide whether to remain a private citizen protecting his children's happiness, or return to public life as a witness to one of the most complex conspiracies in modern British history. Either choice would define the rest of his life, and neither offered the simple peace he had hoped to find after the monarchy's fall. The Windsor dynasty had ended, but Alexander's story was far from over.